Thank you so much, Stefanos, and let me thank the Remark Institute, Samantha and Amy. Just let me say how glad and grateful I am to be here presenting and discussing my research with you. The research deals with the last French military occupation in Papal Rome, which happened between 1849 and 1870. The aim of such a long military presence was threefold. First, the French army to protect papal sovereignty against revolutionary threats by assisting the papal government in state consolidation and in maintaining internal order. By this role in Rome, France intended also to control the dynamics of political conflict and change that had been activated across the Italian states by the rise of liberalism and nationalism in the first half of the century. Finally, for France, this would have resulted in balancing the Austrian imperial influence over northern Italy. In the light of these interconnected aspects, I think that focusing on the French policy of occupation in Rome can improve our understanding of the European international system in the 19th century and also shed new light on the nature of sovereignty within it. Reprising the connected history of France and Italy in the age of revolutions, this work confronts also the reshaping of French imperialism after 1815, a theme on which David Todd's recent book has attracted attention, referring in particular to political, commercial, and jurisdictional practices of informal empire. The research also confronts the contiguity of practices of protected sovereignty between the European legal space and the broader imperial world, and so their place within the history of international law. As many others, I am indebted to Jane Barbank and Freddie Cooper's reflection on layered sovereignty as a tool of imperial governance, to Lauren Benton's work on divided sovereignty and imperial legal policies, and to Anthony Hengi, Andrew Fitzmaurice, and Marty Koskeniemi's intellectual history of the concept of sovereignty in international law. Before delving into analysis, why this slide is not, okay. Before delving into the analysis, I would like to provide some context that not everyone might be familiar with. Since the Congress of Vienna, the Papal States were perceived by political leaders and public opinion as the weak spot in the international order of the Restoration. While the Papal States were only marginally touched by the revolution of the early 20s, fears of generalized unrest in Italy materialized in 1831, when the Papal northern provinces claimed independence and liberal reform in the wake of the French Revolution of July 1830. Two Austrian interventions in the north restored papal sovereignty, while a French expedition occupied the Adriatic port of Ancona to counter Austrian hegemony in the region. The term Anconade entered the diplomatic language to denote a unilateral naval expedition aimed at asserting French imperial interest in the Mediterranean. To stabilize Italy, a conference of 5 great powers summoned the Pope, Gregorius XVI, to enact a program of administrative reforms, which nevertheless remained on paper. So in 1846, the newly elected Pope Pius IX passed some moderate reforms that were mainly intended to limit censorship and to involve economic elites in local and financial administration. Public opinion in Italy and abroad enthusiastically greeted the Pope's first measures, celebrating Pius IX as the promoter of a new era of emancipation through the alliance of religion and liberty. The reform movements spread across Europe, and when the revolution broke out in Paris in February 1848, the name of Pius IX was invoked as a freedom cry by fighters on the barricades. Following what other Italian rules had done, in March 1848, the Pope granted a constitutional chart. But his refusal to go further on the road of reform and to join the national war of independence against Austria raised popular unrest, which culminated in the Roman Revolution of November 1848, and in the Pope's flight to Gaeta, a fortress in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. In February 1849, the Republic was proclaimed in Rome, and at its head was Giuseppe Mazzini, who was by then the celebrated leader of the International Democratic Revolutionaries. Thousands of volunteers came to Rome across Europe and the Atlantic to defend the Republic against the counter-revolutionary reaction of conservative powers. Upon papal request, Republican France, Austria, Spain, and the Kingdom of Two Sicilies sent expeditionary armies to overthrow the Republic and restore papal government. While the Austrians occupied Bologna and the northern provinces of the state, the French took Rome in July 1849. The Spanish and Neapolitan army occupied parts of the south, but withdrew by the end of the year. While with the agreement of the papal government, France and Austria maintained their troops in the state during the 50s. Over the decades, the two powers competed in providing the Holy See with military protection that both saw as the ground for two alternative versions of conservative order in Italy. Between 1859 and 1860, the wars of Italian unification broke such an equilibrium. The Austrian troops left the northern provinces of the Papal State, which were annexed to the Kingdom of Italy, which was a constitutional monarchy that merged the liberal tradition with a new pan-Italian nationalism. Napoleon III opposed this project and kept protecting papal sovereignty in Rome, sealing an alliance with the Holy See that was pivotal in promoting the French imperial interests across the globe. French troops left Rome only in 1866 after an agreement with the Italian government that secured papal sovereignty. But a few months later, volunteers led by Garibaldi invaded the Papal States to annex Rome to Italy, and the French intervened again. This marked the beginning, the Garibaldi volunteers were repelled, which marked the beginning of a second occupation, which was to last until the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Well, when it came to an end, French military presence in Rome had been the longest military occupation in Europe since the fall of Napoleon. Despite this, historians have usually overlooked at its practice, not least because the dismissal of the 1849 expedition as a tactical move motivated by President Bonaparte's attempts to consolidate his power thanks to the support of the Catholic majority of parliament, of the Catholic public opinion, which was, of course, pathway to the coup d'etat of December 1851 and of imperial restoration. However, one might wonder why France did maintain for such a long time an army of occupation at the very high political and financial cost, despite international complications and the stiffening of the Holy See in the face of any internal reform. Answering this question requires a less schematic explanation and an analysis of the many actors involved in the occupation and of the interacting goals. The answer leads to focus on the connection between international and local responses to the revolution and the development of French informal imperialism during the first half of the 19th century. The revival of French imperialism has rested on foreign military intervention, from the 1823 expedition to Spain to the 1828 expedition to Morea, to the already mentioned occupation of Ancon, the expedition to Rio de la Plata in the 40s. In this context, intervening in Rome became strategic because protecting papal sovereignty strengthened French claim to a traditional role as a defender of Christianity, a claim that was used as a tool of influence across the globe, from the Ottoman Empire to Eastern Asia Asia, and Mexico. But military occupation in Rome was also intended to solve the problem of political instability in Papal states. The policies of the occupation which analyzed depended on the combination of these broader goals. In competition with the Austrian Empire, the French reordering project for the Italian peninsula aimed at ensuring post-revolutionary social pacification and political stabilization. France presented itself as the promoter of an institutional experiment aimed at preventing new revolutions through the reconciliation of authority, religion, and civil progress. This project intertwined with the aspiration of a part of the local elites in Papal states and with the political organization undertaken by the papal government after the Restoration. Let's now have a look at the practices of the French military occupation. It should be kept in mind that the respective powers and responsibilities of the foreign military and local authorities were never formally defined. Rather, they were constantly being renegotiated. Vernacular controversies over minor matters concerning the repartition of sovereign powers and jurisdiction were a constant factor in the relationship among French commanders, diplomatic agents, and papal officials. These day-by-day litigations are not of merely anecdotal value. Sometimes they involved the top levels of the two governments, and solutions to such issues constituted legal precedents that oriented the practice of the occupation. They reflected on the perceived status of papal sovereignty and sometimes helped to shape French imperial legal doctrine in the time to come, as we will see. It is possible to isolate different phases of occupation, each one corresponding to different sets of political projects and the relationship between the occupiers and papal authorities. For time's sake, we won't be able to focus on the occupation policies during the 60s, when after the Italian unification and the outbreak of a huge counter-revolutionary insurrection in the former Kingdom of Naples, the French troops were charged to protect the papal border against both the Italian army and counter-revolutionary irregular forces trying to shelter on papal territory. I would like to look more thoroughly at the first decade of the occupation, which allows to observe better the making of occupation practices and their underlying ideology. More than from parliamentary tactics of the anti-republican right wing, the decision to intervene in Rome resulted from a shared vision of the French role in post-revolutionary Europe, a vision that allowed the formation of a coalition including Catholic liberals, moderate conservatives, and the Orleanist center-left. The parliamentary debate on the intervention was marked by a reflection about the tools of French international ascendancy after 1815 and after the liberal revolutions. Adolphe Thiers was a key figure in this coalition, and he was a key figure, of course, in French imperial redressing during the July monarchy. He advocated for an interventionist policy grounded on a concept of civilization, which related to the building of a well-ordered society based on the heritage of the French Revolution. This idea was directly inspired by the Napoleonic model, of which Thiers himself was a distinguished historian. It justified the French expedition as an intervention aimed at restoring a reformist papacy to protect the Italian people against both Republican radicalism and an Austrian counter-revolutionary response. In this aim, the French tried to impose a compromise between the Holy See and the moderate liberals that had backed the Pope's reforms in 1848, that had condemned the Republic, but that were now being deemed responsible for the revolution by Pope Pius IX. The French turned to anti-republican liberals to create a provisional government backed by the occupying army and to influence new papal legislation in attempt to provide the papal state with what Foreign Minister Tocqueville nicknamed serious liberal institutions, including, if not a constitutional chart, at least a civil code and some representative bodies. This project was doomed to failure by a combination of factors, including Pius IX's condemnation of liberalism, Austrian diplomatic pressure, and French internal political change. However, French troops were able to intervene both in Rome and in rural villages to prevent popular violence and state repression against the liberals and republicans, as it was happening instead in the Austrian occupied regions. The hypothesis of taking direct control of the papal administration was discarded because it was seen as a pathway to a war with Austria. But the French established a permanent French police prefecture within the framework and placed formally under the authority of papal police administration. Under many aspects, this interplay facilitated cooperation between papal policy and French military in restoring urban security after revolution and the war. But the main goal of the French police prefecture was to protect papal citizens and foreigners that the papal government intended to prosecute for taking part into the revolution. The prefecture protected them by subtracting them to papal police and by providing them with passports to leave the state. According to French agents, at the beginning of October, more than 30,000 passports had been issued, and more than 5,000 passports were granted to foreigners coming either from Italian states or from across Europe. The new political climate of the early 50s, however, brought about a change in the objective on the French military mission in Rome. On the one hand, French agents acknowledged the impossibility to push the Pope to liberal reforms. On the other hand, in the wake of Louis Napoleon coup d'etat, many French political and diplomatic agents came to see the papacy as the rampart of order against democracy and socialism. According to French ambassador Reneval, France had to revise its policy towards the papal state, confronting the legacy of the revolutionary and Napoleonic wars and taking lessons from that experience. Revolutionary France and Napoleon had tried to reshape the Italian political and social space through territorial conquest, which had resulted in occupying Rome and abolishing papal sovereignty twice. This time, France had to preserve papal sovereignty. To do so, according to Reneval, France had to give up any attempt to promote liberal reforms in the papal states. Rather, France should turn to provide diplomatic advice, technical assistance, and military support to a set of administrative reforms that would have improved the governance of the papal states, thus opening a better era for the Romans. These are words of Reneval. Such a view was widespread among French military and diplomatic agents on the spot. Many of them also shared the idea that the Italian populace was not actually fit to be ruled by liberal institutions. The outbreak of political violence fostered by 1848 reforms was deemed to prove it. The frequency of violent crimes in the urban space of Rome reinforced that idea. French soldiers and the Roman populace regularly met in the streets, taverns, and cafes, entertaining social relations that were eased by language proximity. Ordinary sociability gave occasion to interpersonal conflicts, often resulting into armed violence. This was a common phenomenon under military occupation, but such episodes confirmed stereotypes about the violent nature of the urban lower classes of Rome. And during the 50s, the principal aim of the occupation became strengthening state control over a society perceived as backward, corrupted, passional, and violent. For some of the most insightful French agents, law was at the core of the problem. The violence of the Roman people, as well as the corruption of state administration, was the consequence of a generalized weakness of papal statehood, which resulted for the peculiar legal system of the papal monarchy. There are works by historians as Paolo Prodi, which have thoroughly analyzed what I'm going to say now, and that I need to sum up. But despite the efforts undertaken by papal governments since the Restoration to erase legal pluralism, the blend of different sources of canon, civil, and criminal law within the papal state legal order resulted into a fragmented system of multiple jurisdictions, overlapping and conflicting in a way that made rule of law impossible. This is the situation exemplified in this memorandum by French Ambassador Dramont that you can read in the slide. Civil codification was seen by some agents as a possible solution, but breaking the interconnection of ecclesiastical law and civil law in the papal legal order would have meant touching at the very nature of papal spiritual and political sovereignty. For this reason, after Tocqueville left the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in late 1849, there wasn't any French systemic drive to adopt civil codification. Rather, occasional political measures were taken to address specific problems linked to legal pluralism. This happened, for instance, in 1863, when the papal states were facing a wave of banditry provoked by the civil war fought in southern Italy. Bandits coming from Italian territory crossed the border and sheltered in the marshes of Campomorto and Conca, which were fiefs of the Holy Office and of the Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, that were granted with the right of asylum. Upon French request, the Pope annulled ancient privileges allowing asylum in these lands, and the Papal gendarmerie arrested the bandits. In the context of warfare, the interaction of political conflict, criminal practice, and diplomatic pressure could exert a transformative action over the papal legal space, contributing to erasing traditional areas of legal pluralism. This, however, persisted as a problem in the views of French agents and observers who kept criticizing papal states as backward, unable to ensure rule of law and property rights, and therefore in need of a deep process of legal rationalization and uniformization. This appraisal marked the practices of French occupation during the 50s. Over the decade, French policies in Rome also matched the state rebuilding process undertaken by the papal government after the revolution. Balancing French and Austrian military protection, the papal government was able to maintain some political autonomy, using the competing powers' respective interference to pursue its own specific goals. This related to Pius IX's project of rebuilding a Christian political society. The consolidation of papal monarchy had to serve as an ideal model of a new Christian statehood. French assistance in state organization and centralization could be used instrumentally. The divergent goals of French and papal collaboration made the relationship between the two authorities conflictual. However, it also brought the French to collaborate with a vast range of local political, administrative, and social actors, especially in the fields of public security and social control. We see this dynamic of opportunistic cooperation at work when we look at the only time the papal government considered seriously the behavior of civil codification in 1859. According to the commission charged to write a draft code, the code should not validate the separation of ecclesiastical and civil law that characterized secular society, what the Commission itself called modern European law that made politics independent from religion. Rather, codification was intended to reorder and confirm the existing legal system, providing a public example of how civil law should have been subordinated to a divine law by the intermediation of church power. Codification failed, but the same logic, because the war exploded, but the same logics were at work in military reforms that were much more effective. Resisting French pressure, the papal government rejected conscription because of its link to the political imaginary of citizenship and national sovereignty. The papal army kept recruiting local volunteers and foreign mercenaries. However, private military units were dismantled, the army was professionalized and centralized, and French regulatory norms were adopted on such matters as discipline, service, and careers. In these fields, the cooperation of French military advisors and papal officers that had been trained in Napoleonic armies at the beginning of the century proved to be essential. Policing was another important field of cooperation. The French prefecture, established in 1849, was maintained, and papal authorities saw French military assistance as necessary to control Rome's complex urban space. This was still characterized by a labyrinth of small contorted alleys, by large rural areas within the urban walls, and by strong internal and external mobility that the state didn't control. Destitute peasants who came to the capital looking for jobs during winter were perceived as a permanent criminal and political threat. In the wake of the Restoration, the chief of the papal police significantly described Rome as a forest where city bandits and politically subversives could easily hide. Joint French and papal patrols were put in place to police this space against robbers and killers, echoing models of urban policing developed in England and France from the early 50s. Of course, and I'm getting closer to the conclusion, the question of policing entailed the question of jurisdiction. In the northern provinces, Austrian military courts held huge jurisdictional powers in all matters concerning public security at large, even when involving papal subjects only. Nothing similar happened in the French occupied zone. French military jurisdiction was entrusted only for criminal cases involving French soldiers and for crimes that put the safety of the occupying army at risk. The indeterminacy of such a concept as safety made possible to extend French military jurisdiction when needed, as in the 50s, when the French military courts judged and executed papal subjects guilty of violating the ban on weapons. All in all, France's assistance in repressing crime and violence in Rome was seen as a tool of social disciplining, which by strengthening state control over the society would have brought papal polity to a better level of civilization. One of the French commanders-in-chief summed up this meaning of the occupation by describing French military presence in Rome as force armée et civilisatrice. However, unlike what happened concerning, for instance, consular jurisdiction in the Ottoman Empire or in China or Japan, the French never claimed any broader form of extraterritorial jurisdiction in the papal states, even when cases involving French civilian citizens occurred. Someone nevertheless tried to do so. In the early stages of the occupation, General Monreal, by then commander-in-chief, asked French military jurisdiction to deal with the dispute opposing a Roman merchant and the French cantiniere, a woman attached to the army, named Charlier. Inspired by common practice in Algeria, the general request was grounded on alleged corruption and partiality of the papal courts. The Ministry of War dismissed it. However, this episode is significant for at least two reasons. Despite the tendency to describe the Papal States as a backward society, comparing sometimes it to the Ottoman Empire, this is something that it's very common in the diplomatic papers, or even drawing on well-established Orientalist stereotypes, the political goal of this military occupation made the regime of protection in the Papal States quite different from interference, from other forms of interference imposed over other polities in the world subjected to European imperialism. But these analogies, but also the analogies were many, and the analogies among informal practices based on reordering projects and civilizing ideology were such that the distinction between colonial and the European legal context might fade for actors as Montreal, who moved across the French imperial space. Sometimes French imperial legal thought encapsulated this continuity between practices adopted inside and outside the system of European public law. In his authoritative 1896 Essai sur le protectorat, which you can see on the slide, Franz L'Espagnet wrote that the French Court de Cassation decisions on criminal case concerning military security in occupied Mexico and Rome laid ground for French military jurisdiction over protected countries. Raymond Robin reached similar conclusions in 1913, noting that the French occupation of the Papal States had been the most important 19th century precedent for the proliferation of formal protectorates at the time the author was writing. So, just a few general remarks to conclude. Recently, in a recent article, historian Jonathan Gans has noted that historians who wrote social and political history of military occupations have rarely dealt with how practices are bound up with international norms. Conversely, legal and higher scholars have focused mainly on legal and theoretical definitions of occupation as a phenomenon in the international system. I have tried to analyze together the practices of French occupation and the legal discourse concerning it. My goal was to better understand how sovereignty was construed in the European international system before the rise of positive international law from the 70s on. And I think that the experience of foreign protection put papal sovereignty in fragments. As a result of French and Austrian military occupations, three authorities shared sovereign powers over the papal territory. In the north, the Austrian placed papal civil administration under full foreign military control. The Austrian integrated the occupied papal provinces in a broader area of Austrian imperial dominance that spanned from the Kingdom of Lombardy and Venetia under direct Austrian rule to satellite, independent but satellite dukedoms of the Po Valleys. Austrian troops in the states and in the Papal States were placed under the same command and moved across borders. The French occupation, as we have seen, worked more subtly as it avoided establishing a military administration and claimed to act on behalf of the papal sovereignty. The papal sovereignty under double foreign occupation can be considered, in my opinion, as a case of shared or divided sovereignty, a concept that Lauren Benton used to describe the overlapping of several layers of sovereignty within hierarchical relations of imperial protection. Benton also notes that such areas of uneven sovereignty usually formed where people and polities at the fringes of larger spheres of influence bargained for a measure of autonomy, she says, and courted rival imperial sponsors for protection. So, according to the British Foreign Minister, John Russell, the long duration of foreign military occupation in the Papal States was, I quote, a dangerous departure from the public law of Europe. In Russell's widespread opinion, the European international system was founded on the principle of state sovereignty and independence. Consequently, legal doctrine framed military occupation as a merely temporary situation, resulting either in the restitution of full sovereignty to the occupied country or in its formal annexation. Military intervention to help a government restoring order in a territory subject to its sovereignty was also limited in time and scope. This characterization of military occupation reflected a legal culture that opposed a civilized space of sovereign states from which international law emanated, and the space of less civilized polities that did not enjoy full sovereignty and could be exposed to imperial protection and colonization. As shown by Koskeniemi and Denghi, the entire intellectual framework of late 19th century international law laid on this ground. Within this framework, the situation of the Papal States under foreign occupation appeared to be an anomaly. International lawyers and authoritative journals such as the Revue de droit international and Législation comparée either overlooked it or tried to normalize it as simply one of the many counter-revolutionary interventions legitimized by international conferences in early 19th century Europe. However, in the case of the Papal States, as we have seen, counter-revolutionary intervention had turned up into a longer-lasting form of international military protection exerted by competing imperial powers with, which bore broader transformative and influence goals. Of course, the combination of military occupation and shared sovereignty was not unprecedented in Europe after the Congress of Vienna, which had used it to stabilize troubled regions at the periphery of the Ottoman Empire. The British Protectorate of the Ionian Islands and the joint Russo and Ottoman Protectorate of the Danube Principalities were the most important cases of shared sovereignty within the European order. Foreign military protection of the Papal States was a stage of cooperation practices between rival empires and weakened governments in areas that were politically critical. The arrangements found to stabilize these areas characterized Europe as a gradient of sovereignties placed under different types of independence or external control. An anecdote, just to conclude, it is significant that in 1864, when the prominent jurist Henry Sumner Maine backed British intervention against banditry in the independent principalities of Kathiawar in India, but outside the governorate of British India, you referred to European state practice to justify the limitation of Kathiawar sovereignty in a memorandum that Benton has regarded as a crucial piece of British imperial constitution because it raised sovereignty as a set of powers that could be divided among several authorities. The shape international law took in the late 19th century obscured the history of shared sovereignty in Europe, confining it to an extra-European world of colonies and protectorates. However, both Henry Maine and French jurists such as Despagnet show, in my opinion, how important European international practice was to scholars who were defining the tools of imperial governance outside the fictional political and legal space described by European public law. And thank you so much.